The Heretic Order, Chapter 3. It was a perfect morning for a run. There were no clouds in the sky and the air was cool. Lily stretched on the stone wall surrounding the courtyard in front of the girls' dorm. She was a little tight from the day before and didn't want to pull anything. There were no sick days at the Abbey. It had been a good week and she didn't want to end it with a beating. She took off in a brisk jog, through a small courtyard, down an alley, then around the church, and through the main courtyard to the gate. Lily passed through the main gate and waved to the guards on the steel gantry above. The road from the Abbey swept left to the main road. Instead, Lily turned right, down a grass bank mottled with dandelion, and headed towards the river. A rocky path ran parallel to the river. It was a lovely place to walk a dog before the world ended. Lily jumped over tree roots and large rocks as she ran, not trying to beat her personal best, but to enjoy the cool air and the morning bird song. When the stone walls of Ravendale were visible through the trees, she turned right off the path and up a wooded hill to the town. Lily tried to keep her pace while dodging the trees until she came to a dry stone wall. A small gap allowed her to jump through without slowing. Then she rejoined the road and ran to the town. Lily grew up in Ravendale. Owen had an apartment in an alleyway off the market square above a pub. When she was younger, Lily loved to watch from her window at the market stalls in the morning. At night, she would watch the drunks stumble out of the pub. Sometimes a flyer would swoop down and grab a drunkard. A few days would go by before people started to stumble home drunk again. Lily watched in curiosity, hoping to see another death from the safety of her room. Lily ran through the gatehouse and past the guards with a nod as she ran. The townsfolk had a respect for the knights that had burgeoned to distrust over time. They wore a fake politeness, a cap of diplomacy necessary to keep the peace. The guards had basic equipment compared to the knights. They wore thick leather coats over civilian clothing, as much to defend from the elements than vampires, and they had nothing to protect from bullets. She ran up the cobbled road to the town centre and circled the perimeter. Passing the alley to Owen's house, she had to stop herself from ringing his doorbell. Lily was 15 and an apprentice to the knighthood. Her old life of hugs and kisses from her adopted dad were over. She had to prove she didn't need him anymore. If she trained harder than the others, if she studied for longer into the night, she would be prime STG material. Then Owen would respect her. A light came on in Owen's apartment and she set off running. Harry was setting up his fishing equipment and Lily hid behind a tree and watched him by the river. Harry fiddled with the end of his fishing rod, then cast out to the center of the deep but slow-moving river. Lily knew the surface was calm, but there was a deadly current below. Lily walked through the wood, trying not to make a sound.
"What are you fishing for, Harry?"
she asked. Harry jumped and looked around at her.
"Damn it, Lil! I almost fell in!"
Harry shouted. Lily laughed as she crossed the riverside path and down to the rocky shore. Harry remembered what James asked him the night before.
"Hey, Lily,"
Harry asked. He reeled in and an orange float bobbed above the surface.
"What?"
she replied.
"James asked me what I thought about you last night in our room."
Lily pursed her lips and put her hands on her hips.
"James, son of Abbot Montgomery, the ultra-devout Christian?"
Harry nodded with a smile.
"He might be questioning his vow of chastity."
Lily felt blood rush to her face and she punched him in the arm. Harry feigned injury, then felt a tug on the line. He snapped the rod up and started to reel. A minute later, he pulled out a fish and removed the hook from its mouth.
"What is it?"
"See the multicolour sides? It's a rainbow trout."
The fish spasmed and its beautiful colours sparkled in the early morning light. Harry pulled out a small knife and held it to the fish in the middle of the gills.
"Wait, Harry, can you throw it back? I've seen enough blood the past few days."
Harry pulled the knife away from the fish and smiled.
"Sure, Lil. You owe me breakfast, though."
Lily laughed.
"I hope you don't mind stale toast and questionable butter."
Harry nodded.
"Sounds good to me."
He lowered the fish to the river and let it slip through his hands. For a few moments, the two apprentices watched the water flow by.
"What do you think of James?"
"He's a good soldier."
"That's not what I meant."
Lily kicked a rock into the river.
"I know, he's okay, I guess."
"Cool."
Harry said.
"Cool."
Lily asked.
"Yep."
He replied. Lily pushed him again. Harry grabbed a handful of maggots and threw them at her. Lily screamed and ran back to the Abbey. Everyone came to the truck at 8 and Morgan opened the back door. The mountain of silver looked larger than it did the night before. Lily instantly regretted her early morning jog. "Grab 2 bars and take them to the catacombs below the armory. Rinse and repeat," Owen said.
Sir, you sound rough. Are you okay?
Lily asked. Morgan stifled a laugh. "Yes, Lily, I must be coming down with something," Owen replied.
Down with a hangover, sir?
Florence asked. Morgan and the apprentices laughed. "Miss Carnegie, you have a 4-day weekend due to your actions in the field. Do you want me to revoke that privilege?" Owen asked.
No, sir.
Florence replied. Owen stumbled to the truck and grabbed 2 bars. "Good, let's go," he said. Lily came up the stairs from the catacombs. She walked past Owen talking to Knight Anderson. Lily always wondered what their relationship was. Owen and Jess spent many nights together. When Lily was 7, Jess would bring dinner to Owen's apartment. She always brought fish and chips for Lily, a bribe. The dinner dates stopped after a few months, but they still acted strange when they saw each other. Lily wondered how long the no-marriage rule had existed. Owen may have been in love with Jess, but the draw of duty was stronger.
Hey, Lil. You should come see me this weekend. I have some ideas about something I can make with this silver. A nice necklace.
Jess said. Lily stopped dead on the top step.
I'm kidding. I've been toying with the idea of compressed air weaponry. A silent flechette thrower, maybe.
Jess said. "That's more Florence's thing," Lily replied. Jess smiled at Owen. He shrugged back. Owen stood in the doorway and Lily passed in front of him. "Lunchtime in 20 minutes. Better get a hurry on," he said. He winked at Jess, then left the armory. The dining hall was full. There were no squads on missions. Anyone that arrived 5 minutes after 12 had to take their lunch and eat it in the courtyard. They went early, but Lily, Harry, Florence and James struggled to find seats together. The dining hall, furnished with long oak tables, was alive with laughter and conversation. At one time, centuries ago, it was where the monks sat in quiet contemplation over their gruel. Now it was the place to trade news of the outside world, of the savage men to the north, of radio stations in Europe, still playing automated messages in languages nobody understood. The apprentices placed their plastic trays down onto the table. They squeezed between a group of knights and another group of apprentices. Lily looked down the line of trays and saw everyone had the same dollop of cottage pie. Across the table, James stared past her with glowing eyes. 4 knights entered the dining hall in black fatigues.
"It's Captain Hollister and the STG,"
James said. The Special Tactics Group, or STG, are the highest echelon of the Abbey's soldiers. They take the most difficult mission, the killing of other men. Knights cannot take a human life unless in direct defense of the Abbey. With so few people left, murder threatened the continuity of the species. The STG hunted raider leaders like the brutal dictator known only as Turbo. Every apprentice wanted to be in the STG.
Go talk to him, flirt a little, show some skin,
Florence said through a mouthful of mashed potato. Harry and Lily laughed, but James didn't notice.
"I'll be in the STG one day. You'll be riding in that beat-up truck until you retire,"
James said. "I love Gramps. Sure, he smells like sour milk, but he's got character," Lily said. Captain Hollister grabbed a tray and piled it with food. He ushered a group of apprentices to give up their seats with a glance and a grunt. The apprentices got up and looked around for another seat, but finding none, they ate their meals standing.
They're a bunch of dicks, the Abbot's pet dogs. No offence, James,
Florence said.
"No offence for insulting them or my dad,"
He replied.
Both, I guess.
She replied. James mumbled something and hunched over his food. Lily slapped Florence in the chest and held a finger over her mouth. Florence pretended to zip hers. The Abbey became a ghost town on weekends. Many of the knights visited their parents or siblings in Ravendale and the surrounding farms. Others drank their wage in the pubs, numbing themselves for the week ahead. The apprentices with families chose to spend their free time at home. Lily and a few of the other orphans read books or played tattered board games in the dorm living room. Harry hiked up to his family farm in the Dales. Florence sometimes stayed in the Abbey. This weekend she went home to her family in the town. Lily didn't understand why Florence spent the weekends at home. She seemed to return to the Abbey in a worse mood every time. Lily wondered what her parents could be doing. They always seemed so convivial. Florence's mum would sometimes bring homemade shortbread for the girls to share. She felt sorry for Lily, not having a mother of her own. James cleaned his father's house, scrubbing the floors and ironing his cassocks. When the abbot was happy, James would help the monks perform their duties in the chapel. The weekend went too fast. They always do after a week of hard work. On Monday, Owen's apprentices watched as another group left the abbey for their first mission. When the truck disappeared, the guards bolted the gate shut. Owen ordered the apprentices to grab their full battle dress for physical training. Other knights let their apprentices exercise in shorts and t-shirts, but not Owen. His apprentices wear full Nomex combat clothing, with loaded plate carriers. Magazines, grenades and all. The apprentices came back to the main courtyard. Owen marched them to the weight training area behind the barracks. "You all did a good job on your first mission. As a treat, I thought we could do a heavy deadlift session," Owen said. Harry slapped James on the back, then grabbed a couple battered steel plates from the rack. They both bounded over to the deadlift platform like puppies. Owen walked over to a barrel filled with steel bars and chose the perfect tool of demoralization. He pulled one out and handed it to Lily. She grabbed it and threw it down onto a patch of rubber-coated concrete with a clang. Tens of thousands of repeated blows had hardened the rubber matting. Lily wondered why it was even there at this point. "A 10 plate on each side," Owen said. James put a plate on one side of the bar. Harry slid his on the other. Owen walked over and put his feet under the bar. He bent down, then lowered his legs until he grabbed the cold steel. He looked forward into an imaginary horizon, then stood up, bringing the bar to rest below his hips. He performed 15 slow repetitions, then stepped off the deadlift platform. "Nice and slow, focus on your form. 10 reps, he said. The apprentices took their turn to lift the weight. They didn't break a sweat. "The bar and plates make 40 kilos. If you didn't manage that, I would kick you out of the abbey," Owen said. He grabbed 2 more 10-kilo plates and slipped them onto the bar. This time his reps were quicker, with a cadence you could dance to. 55 kilos, 8 reps, go, Owen said. The boys went first. James slammed the weight down on his last rep and swaggered back to the other apprentices. Harry hesitated on the first rep, but after corrected his footing, he had no trouble finishing. Florence managed her set even though her brown hair had fallen in front of her face. When she finished, she tied it in a short ponytail. Lily stepped up to the bar and performed 5 repetitions with ease. She panicked when each after became harder, until she almost didn't make the last. Owen walked over to the rack of old mismatched weights and came back a moment later with one in each hand. He had grabbed a small length of rope and slipped it into his pocket. He slipped the weights onto the bar, then turned around to the apprentices. "Now I want you all to lie on the floor, legs and arms crossed," Owen said. The apprentices looked at each other in hesitation. "Bang!" Owen shouted. Lily jumped and stepped away from the deadlift platform. "Come on, guys. A grenade has blown up at your feet. Get on the floor," Owen said. The apprentices obliged. Owen stepped up to the bar and performed 10 lifts. He stepped off the platform, bent down, and with his left hand, grabbed Lily by her body armor. With his right, he slipped the rope under her legs and deadlifted her. He made sure not to drop her, then performed the same exercise with each of his apprentices. "James, you're up," Owen said. James jumped up and dusted off his uniform with his sleeve. He grabbed the bar and performed 9 reps. "One more." James pulled the bar up again, shaking with sweat. "One more," Owen ordered. This happened 4 more times before James couldn't lift the weights a centimeter off the ground. "Amazing work, James. Now your team is out in the open and they are bleeding to death. Drag each of them to the benches over there," Owen said. James looked across the small courtyard filled with exercise equipment. The benches sat in the shade of a large sheet metal awning. He stepped off the platform and grabbed Florence as she was the closest. He reached underneath her head and grabbed her armor's drag handle. He slid her across the grass into the shade, then jogged back to get Lily. "Very chivalrous, James. Hurry up," Owen barked. James dragged Lily and dropped her on Florence. He couldn't help but laugh as he ran back to get Harry.
"James, is that you? I see a light, James. I'm cold, James. Mama?"
Harry said. James looked up at Owen, who was stifling a smirk. Then he grabbed Harry and made sure to drop him hard on top of the girls. James sat on a bench, head bowed, and tried to catch his breath. "Excellent work, James. Lily, you're next," Owen said. Lily managed 5 repetitions with Owen spurring her on. She almost passed out as she lifted the weight twice more. Owen saw there was nothing left in her. He nodded. She approached James first as he was heaviest. She knew if she couldn't manage him first, then she never would. She grabbed the drag handle on his back and dug her feet into the ground. He wouldn't budge. She tried again. She pulled with her back, trying to gain enough momentum. He didn't move. "He's dead. Move on," Owen shouted. Lily ran over to Florence and grabbed the pull handle on her armor.
"Hey, what about me?"
Harry said. "Shut up, you're mortally wounded," Owen said.
"Yes, sir."
Harry replied, then lay his head back down. Lily pulled backwards as hard as she could and got Florence moving. Lily quickened her pace to keep her momentum but fell, landing hard on her back. She's dead and Harry's not worth saving anyway. You have failed your team, Owen said.
It's not fair. I'm obviously not as strong as James.
Lily said. Why is it not fair? Owen asked. He walked over and pulled Lily off the ground, standing her up like a doll. He smelled of cold sweat and stale beer.
I'm a girl, of course I'm not as strong as him,
she said. I'm aware of biology, but it's not an excuse to fail your team. Know your limits and work around them, Owen said.
This is fucking stupid,
Lily shouted. The other apprentices stopped playing dead and looked at Lily with wide eyes. Owen looked at the ground and nodded. Harry, James, what are your 1-rep max deadlifts now? Owen asked.
140.
James replied.
About 115.
Harry added. Florence, go get Knight Campbell and tell him I need his help with crane training, Owen said.
Yes, sir. But what's crane training?
Florence asked. It's a rite of passage for knights, but you guys need to learn its lesson now, Owen said.
This old thing's awesome. Why have we never been down here before?
Florence asked. Harry shrugged, then pointed to a recovery truck partially hidden by waist-high grass. A well-maintained yellow crane sat on its flat bed. He followed a chain with his eyes. From the crane he could see it connected to an old pickup truck, modified to look like a riot vehicle. He felt it best not to tell the others. Lily would worry. Owen and Campbell followed 15 minutes later. Owen walked up to the police van and opened the back door. He pulled out 2 fake guns made of solid steel bar and handed them to the boys. James, Harry, you are up first. Get in the back and buckle up, he said. Campbell handed the boys 2 ballistic helmets.
Put these on, lads.
The boys jumped into the back of the van and Owen slammed the door shut behind them. They heard a bolt slide on the other side. A shape resembling Owen moved away from the car. It was difficult to see through the scratched plexiglass and steel mesh covering the windows.
Has he locked us in?
Harry asked.
Don't be a baby, we can fit out that sunroof,
James replied. Harry shrugged, then buckled himself into one of the 4 seats. They heard the other truck roar to life. They could smell the fuel had sat for too long. The pickup jolted. Harry pulled his fake rifle to his chest.
Wait, Owen, what are we supposed to do?
Harry shouted. Before they had an answer, the car started to ascend. James grabbed his seatbelt and tightened it. They moved out from the bank towards the center of the river. Then a moment later, they started to descend. Harry looked out the murky window to see the grass bank give way to pebbles. The pebbles preceded the unmistakable brown water of the river swale.
Oh shit,
James shouted. Harry knew if James was swearing, it meant they were in serious trouble. Harry was mute in fear.
Why does it have to be water?
The car swayed as the current caught it, jolting them sideways. It moved again, but this time, down. James whispered a prayer as the sunroof disappeared under the murky water. When they were fully submerged, the car leaned forward, then flipped over thanks to the buoyancy of the air pocket in the vehicle. A row of bright blue LED lights shone from under the water, making the submerged part of the cabin visible. The car kept sinking. The muddy water kissed the boy's cheeks. James was the first to unbuckle and he fell, gasping as the cold water thrust him to action. Harry was too shocked to move, like a survivor of a plane crash waiting for instruction while they asphyxiate on smoke. James unbuckled him and Harry fell into the water. When he emerged, his helmet was covering his eyes. Harry threw it off and brushed his hair off his face. The water was now past the seats and the boys stood, breathing in a small air pocket at what used to be the floor. Up is down, down is up, as above, so below. The van lurched forward as it dug into the riverbed. Their lips touched the floor as they breathed. Dry mud from their boots had turned to slime and James spat out a tuft of grass. He felt grit in his teeth, and he knew he would have to spend the rest of the day disinfecting his mouth or he would get sick and die like his mum. Where did that come from? James looked at Harry, who seemed to be matching his level of panic.
What if the mud gives me cancer? Or some necrotic disease?
James dunked his face into the water to drown out the sticky thoughts. He instantly felt calmer.
Door!
James shouted. He disappeared under the water again. Harry was alone now. If it wasn't for the LED lights, he would be blind. Harry had nightmares tamer than this. James emerged a moment from the brown water, and Harry resisted the urge to hug him.
No good, it's locked,
James said.
What about the sunroof?
Harry asked.
Buried.
James replied. Harry caught his breath and steadied his thoughts. He pulled the emergency release tab on his armor. It floated for a moment, then sank as the pouches and layers of fabric filled with brown river water. He removed James's helmet and found he could get further up into the air pocket to match Harry's level. This slight move in a positive direction calmed them somehow.
We can use the rifles,
Harry said through a mouthful of water.
They aren't real, dumbass.
James replied.
Give me a fulcrum and I shall move the world,
Harry said. He dived into the water and plunged the steel bar into a small gap between the sunroof and the pebble-strewn riverbank. He splashed around for his helmet, then placed it under the bar, creating a lever. He came back to the surface and was closer to James than he had intended.
I'm going to stand on the bar and push against the roof. I need you to place your helmet under the gap. We can then lift the end of the van up enough to slide under,
Harry said. James looked away and mouthed something, then returned his attention to Harry and smiled.
It won't be as heavy as you think. The tires will add buoyancy,
James said. Harry nodded like a maniac.
Go now,
he said. The helmet moved as Harry increased the pressure, but seemed to settle into the rocks. He pushed his legs down against the bar and his hands up against the floor. The van creaked, moaned, and then moved. A little and a moment later, James surfaced.
My helmet is under. If we're careful, we can stack our ballistic plates under the helmet and raise the roof off the ground. We should be able to slip out the gap,
James said.
Well, I don't have any other ideas, so let's get moving,
Harry said. They went under the water 3 more times as they raised the van enough to slip a plate under. When they finished, there was a 30-centimetre gap they could swim through. It was still too tight, so they went back down. James slid his legs into the gap. He kicked the riverbed stones and dug a slight channel. It was enough. He grabbed Harry and pushed him under and through the hole by his feet. It was too tight to swim through. When Harry was free of the van, he turned around and grabbed James's hand. One sharp pull later, and they were free and swimming towards the surface. The boys crawled onto the beach and lay on the pebbles. Owen walked past them and jumped into the river. He came out of the water with an armful of body armor and helmets. He dropped them onto the beach by the boys, then went back into the waiter. This time he came out with the 2 Faki guns. He waved at Knight Campbell, and a moment later the van raised, dripping from the river, and sat down on the grass bank the right way up.
Catch your breath, lads,
Campbell said. He held a metal box in his hand that controlled the crane.
Cars always flip in water. It can be difficult to know which way is up. I've known knights that couldn't get out.
Owen wrung out his shirt and the apprentices saw his scarred body. Life had taken its toll on him, with small dots where he was hit with birdshot to a large burn on his right shoulder from a Molotov cocktail. His left pectoral muscle was embellished with an eagle holding a skull in its talons. Under the eagle were the letters STG. He laid his shirt on the pebbles to dry. You panicked and lost your gear. If this was real, you would be vampires, or roasting on a spit by nightfall. Girls, your turn, Owen said. James stared at the tattoo he hoped would one day to have on his chest.
Sir, I didn't realize you'd been in the STG.
Owen looked down at his faded tattoo. I was. A long time ago before it meant Special Tactics Group, he replied.
What do you mean?
Florence asked, momentarily forgetting the brutal test ahead of her. Sturmgewehr. It means assault rifle in German. I like to think we were mercenaries, but gang would be more accurate. It's just me and Hollister left from our original group, Owen said. He sighed after he finished speaking and his eyes were lost in memory. Owen shook his head, walked up the beach and up the grass bank to the girls. He handed them the rifles. The girls looked past him at the boys staring into the abyss, eyes as wide as the moon. James would have unloaded a magazine into Owen if he had a real rifle. Know your limits, work around them. I know you can do it, Owen said.
Would you really let us drown?
Florence asked. Knight Campbell shook his head and winked at the girls. He held up the crane remote. Lily unbolted the van door and climbed in without saying a word. Owen swore he could smell teenage hormones and anger on her. Florence sighed and followed her friend. The seats were cold and wet as they buckled themselves in. Florence sat silent with a fake rifle held tight across her chest. Whoever made it was clearly inspired by Kalashnikov. The car dropped into the water. Within seconds, the cabin filled. It hadn't been this fast for the boys. Lily could feel the heat from her cheeks as she knew Owen was testing her. She hated how he would go out of his way to prove a point. Lily hit the buckle, pushed away from the seat and spun around in the water. The air in the cabin and the vehicle's tires caused the car to flip, as it had for the boys. She threw off her helmet and swam to the surface. her cheek pressed up against the checkered steel floor, and she breathed the precious pocket of air. Florence came up moments later.
The boys must have slipped out the sunroof, but there's no way we are lifting this thing.
Florence said.
Owen knows that. It's the point of this, the bloody psycho.
Lily said.
Look for anything we can dismantle. I have a multi-tool in my plate carrier. Screws, nuts, anything, just look.
Florence said. Lily nodded and dived under the water. She struggled to remain submerged. A full battle dress traps a lot of air in all the pockets and layers of fabric. She checked the back door. Torque screws fixed a perspex window in place. Lily swam to the surface and was met by Florence catching her breath.
You don't happen to have a Torx bit?
Lily asked.
Palsy drive and flat head.
Florence replied.
Shit, did you find anything?
Lily asked. Florence came closer to Lily.
There's a hole rusted through the side of the bed. We can open it up with the pipe rifles, but it won't be big enough to swim through.
Florence replied. Lily dived down with Florence and they bashed the grape-sized hole with the fake rifles until it became the size of a fist. They swam back to the surface. Lily lowered her head and smiled. She looked sinister in the harsh light of the LEDs below.
Do you have any explosives?
Lily asked. Florence laughed.
I do. I've been messing around with an RDX phthalate mix.
She replied and patted a grenade pouch.
What length fuse?
Lily asked.
5 seconds.
Florence replied. A wide smile crept over her face.
Do you have any rope?
Lily asked. Florence thought for a second, then pulled out her knife. She sliced the seatbelt off the chair next to her and handed it to Lily. She handed the grenade to Lily, but dropped it. It floated to the surface. Lily grabbed it and tied the length of seatbelt tight around the grenade.
The current should take it to the front of the vehicle. It will blow high and flip the car.
Lily said.
That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. The fragmentation will shred us to pieces.
Florence said.
It won't reach us in 6 feet of water. The steel windshield should protect us from the concussive blast.
Lily replied. Lily felt the weight of the grenade in her hand. Florence sighed, and then they both dived down to the hole. Lily stuffed all the seatbelt through the hole and held on to the end. If the grenade caught on anything, they would die. She placed the grenade through the hole, hesitated for a moment, then pulled the pin. Florence's homemade grenade had no lever. Once she pulled the pin, there was no going back. She pushed it through the hole and the current took it. The seatbelt went taut. A moment later, a violent shove hit her sideways. Lily was thrown back as the pickup flipped over.
What was I doing again?
Lily searched for an air pocket, but the sunroof had filled with water. Florence handed her a fake rifle and pointed up to daylight. Florence readied a smoke grenade. They climbed up and stood on the roof of the vehicle with their heads emerging from the river.
We go out fighting,
Florence said, then pitched the grenade towards the pebble beach. The girls swam 5 meters to the shore and trudged up the beach. They aimed their rifles and ran through the smoke. Harry and James were clapping and laughing like idiots. The girls walked up to the group, panting and dripping, then threw down the rifles.
Know your limits, work around them,
Lily said with a bloody smile. Lily looked at Florence, her face covered in dirt and her nose bleeding. Lily touched her nose and it was wet with blood as well. It's an overpressure injury. The blast burst the vessels in your nose. Your brain will have bounced around a bit. Your plan was dangerous, but it worked, so I can't be angry, Owen said. Lily looked at the boys sitting in the grass, their eyes still large thanks to their near brush with death. She knew when her adrenaline wore off, she would spend the rest of the day with earth-shattering existential anxiety. The curious look of worry and pride on Owen's face made it all worth it, though. Campbell, reset the training rig. Apprentices, get your asses over to Brother Matthews and get a medical. If you aspirated water, you could die of pneumonia. Girls, spend the night in the hospital. You might have concussions, Owen said. The apprentices saluted and stumbled towards the abbey. Lily turned around.
You nearly killed us. I hate you, Owen,
she said. Knight Campbell hurried himself with the crane. He couldn't bear the arguing with his 5 sisters. It's why he left his family farm. I hope you do, Lily. One day you will thank me, he replied. Lily clenched her fists and shook her head. She cried a single furious tear, then turned and caught up with her friends. James sauntered into his bedroom and threw his wet clothes towards a grey laundry bag under the window. He brushed small sticks and the river dirt from his blonde hair and sat on his bed trying to calm down. Minutes later, he came out his room dressed in well-fitting tan trousers and a light blue Oxford shirt. He left and locked the door behind. James crossed the small courtyard from his building to the church. He entered the church by the east door, paid his respects at the altar, then left by the west door. The abbot's house was between the church, the monks' lodgings, and the north wall. James smiled at his father sitting in the front garden and closed the gate behind him. He walked up the ornate path that bisected bushes of pungent-smelling herbs and sat on a white metal chair opposite his dad. A large bush of white roses caught his eye.
The roses are looking good, fuller than last summer,
James said.
Potassium nitrate. It adds potassium and nitrogen to the soil. My Floribunda can't get enough, it seems. If you mix it with magnesium, diesel, and a few other indignants, it makes quite a potent explosive.
James heard the mispronunciation, but he didn't mention it. The abbot poured a cup of tea for James from a blue and white porcelain teapot.
Yes, son. The Lord has been good to us this year with rain and ample sunshine,
he said. James added a splash of milk to his cup and sipped. I assume you know of our successful mission, James asked.
Owen Davis dropped a brick of brilliant silver onto my desk last night. You have done the Abbey a great service. We can manufacture more weapons, more silver bullets, more power. You've done the Lord's work, my son,
the abbot replied. James finished his tea and placed it on a small white table.
We came back late. What were you doing in the rectory that hour?
James asked. He looked at the abbot and noticed a vagueness about his presence, a vagueness that had been building since the death of James's mother.
I haven't been sleeping well, troubled by thoughts of our future,
the abbot replied. James studied his father's face. He was getting too old too quick, and the lines around his eyes made James check his pockets under the table. The thought of aging always made him feel strange. Everything was where it should be, at least that he could control it.
Tell him, James. Tell him, James. Tell him, James. Tell him, James.
He checked his pockets. His penknife was still there.
Tell him, James.
The sticky thoughts were extra viscous that day.
Owen has gone too far this time, Dad. He made us do crane training. I could have drowned. Brother Matthew said I'm fine, but I'm sure I breathed in some of that nasty river water. I'll die of pneumonia before the end of summer, I just know it,
James said.
Did you escape?
The abbot asked.
Yes, but he had no right to make us.
The abbot cut him off.
You survived, so I don't know what you're griping about. You are a strong boy. I worry less of you and more of the future of the Abbey and the degenerates in Ravendale,
the abbot said. He snipped the head off a red tulip and stared at it on the floor.
We are doing okay, aren't we? I mean, our population's growing. No flyer attacks in weeks,
James said. The abbot's right hand trembled as he reached up to hold the cross hanging from his neck.
I have been to Ravendale and seen how they behave. They are not afraid of the vampires anymore, and I am losing my hold over them. They no longer observe the Sabbath, for goodness sake,
the abbot said.
The people in the town aren't all bad,
James said.
Do not be bound together with unbelievers. For what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness?
The abbot said, saliva spraying off his lips with each word.
Corinthians,
James said.
It was the sinful ways of the past that gave us the vampire plague. Like Sodom and Gomorrah before us, God decided we needed to be reset,
the abbot said.
You can't force people to convert. If they don't want to accept Christ, so be it,
James said. The abbot stood up and bent down so James could taste his breath.
You were not alive in the beginning. I was. Millions of souls left this plane. Don't you dare speak to me about what God wants. I have seen his hand. I have seen his spear. Without the 5 devoted who gathered survivors 40 years ago, nobody in Ravendale or the Abbey would be here,
the abbot said, spitting at every word. James had nowhere to go. He tried to move his head back, but the abbot breathed into his face. James felt the same way he did as a kid, when the town alarm rang and the flyers came. He felt the same way as he did the night his mother loosened her grip on his hand and closed her eyes for the last time.
Tell him, James, the church. The church, the church, the church. Dad, Owen burned down a church on the mission. We could have driven past, but he made Knight Morgan stop,
James said. His voice trembled, unsure of himself. The abbot clenched his fist.
For what purpose?
He asked.
It was a flyer's nest,
James replied, almost whispering.
I see, son,
the abbot said. He turned away from James and walked to the rosebush. He pulled a stem towards him and smelled a plump white rose.
I want you to tell Paladin Klein to see me. She should be in the barracks.
The abbot said. James left the garden. The abbot didn't turn to see him leave.